So welcome to the North London Buddhist Centre Saturday morning class. And this is one of our monthly talks. We've been having them for 8 months now, or for 6 months, and it'll be 8 months altogether on the Eightfold Path. My name is Ratnaprabha. If you haven't been here before, so welcome. I just wanted to start by contradicting myself at the very beginning of this talk, which is going to be on riding the wind, energy in the Eightfold Path. And just when we're thinking about leading a spiritual life, a Buddhist life or whatever, you do come across a lot of contradictions. Anger, for example, anger, what a vicious, destructive thing. Surely we need to deal with our anger. We need to damp it down. We need to get rid of it. Or, no, anger is essential. You need anger if you're going to get things done. And this lockdown, the lockdown is a horrible deprivation, a deprivation of freedom, a deprivation of company. But no, this lockdown is a chance to relish solitude. It's a chance to lead a simple and a focused life. And how do we decide when we get these contradictions? And I think that Buddhism doesn't answer this question. Buddhism does not have a simple answer. The subtlety of Buddhism can be something which is really frustrating. It would be so nice if everything was clear-cut, but in real life, it's not like that. And so maybe fortunately, Buddhism doesn't try to simplify things. It doesn't try to simplify things into an easy dogma. Words can never sum up reality. And that even means that sometimes you can make opposite statements. You can say things that contradict each other, and both of them are true. For example, you might say that Buddhahood, enlightenment, is simply a matter of just waking up in the here and now. It's a direct realization. Or you might say that enlightenment is the end of a path, the end of the most difficult and most challenging path that any human being could ever face. And somehow, both of these things are true. So in this series of Buddhist talks, we're looking at the spiritual path, we're looking at the Noble Eightfold Path, which is the best known formulation of the Buddhist path. And you could say the Eightfold Path is a path of 8 stages, but the traditional word, astanga, means 8 limbs or branches. So they don't necessarily come one after the other. Anyway, this week we've got to limb number 6, perfect effort. And I want to talk about effort in Buddhism, and especially energy and enthusiasm. If you just imagine you could wake up every morning, you were eager, you were delighted with the prospect of grappling with your life, with your mind, with your experience, grappling with this very, very imperfect world. Yeah, imagine that. That would be great. But it doesn't always happen that way. And if this path is a tough one, it's going to take a lot of energy. Yet, as soon as we get in touch with what energy really means, we find once again a lot of paradoxes, a lot of opposites, which are both true at once. We need to be very different. The world needs to be very different. So we need huge energy to break through. Yet, a willed and a forceful energy just reinforces the ego. So, for example, I think of the current Black Lives Matter campaign. And we all know that Buddhism is non-violent. So it looks as if you should hold back your anger at injustice. You should be meek and you should be mild. Yet when you meet an unacceptable obstacle, it's immensely frustrating. And perhaps the mood of anger is the best way to ensure that something changes. And I mentioned also frustration at the lockdown in response to the virus crisis. What's it like for you being largely confined to your home? Maybe it's a terrible deprivation, maybe it's a limit on your freedom, but is it all bad? How are you finding it? And lots of people have said to me how the simplification of life and even the enforced solitude can be something very rewarding. In fact, in Buddhist tradition, intense practice can be done in solitude, and maybe it's even best done in solitude. So I want to move into the substance of this talk with a story about the great Buddhist 11th century Tibetan master Milarepa. And Milarepa practiced for many years in solitude, on solitary retreat, in remote mountain caves, right through the snows of winter, living on his own, a life of great deprivation, not even a weekly trip to the supermarket with 2-meter social distancing. And his teacher had sent him into the mountains. I'll show you a picture of Milarepa if I can do that. Here we go. I hope you can see that. So there's Milarepa up in the high mountains of Tibet, sitting outside his cave in deep meditation.
I can't see it.
I'll try again.
Okay.
Sometimes it takes a little while for the screen share to come up. While I'm screen sharing, by the way, I can't see the chat or anything, so one of the co-hosts can interrupt me if you need to say anything. So I hope that you can see that now. Picture of Milarepa. And now I'm going to go back so that you can see me, and so I can see my my text. Yes, so his teacher knew that only uncompromising practice and huge effort in meditation would break his very serious mental habits. So there he was, year after year. And in this particular story, which is the very first one in the songs of Milarepa, the 100,000 songs of Milarepa, we meet him before the time of his enlightenment, still practicing hard, dealing with his own emotions, his own distractions and so on, where he lived in a cave called the Eagle's Castle. And this is what it says in the book. Once the great Tibetan yogi Milarepa was staying at the Eagle Castle of Red Rock Jewel Valley, absorbing himself in the practice of meditation. Feeling hungry, he decided to prepare some food, but after looking about, he found there was nothing left in the cave, neither water, nor fuel, let alone salt, oil, or flour. It seems that I have neglected things too much, he said. I must go out and collect some wood for the fire. He went out. But when he'd gathered a handful of twigs, a sudden storm arose, and the wind was strong enough to blow away the wood and to tear his ragged robe. When he tried to hold the robe together, the wood blew it away. When he tried to clutch the wood, the robe blew apart. And frustrated, Milarepa thought, although I have been practicing the Dharma and living in solitude for such a long time, I'm still not rid of ego clinging. What's the use of practicing Dharma? Dharma meaning practicing the Buddhist method, the Buddhist path, if one cannot subdue ego clinging. Let the wind blow away my wood if it likes. Let the wind blow my robe off if it wishes. And thinking thus, he ceased resisting. But due to weakness from lack of food, with the next gust of wind, he could no longer withstand the storm, and he fell down in a faint. When he came to, the storm was over. High up on the branch of a tree, he saw a shred of his clothing swaying in the gentle breeze. The utter futility of this world and all its affairs struck Milarepa, and a strong feeling of renunciation overwhelmed him. Sitting down on a rock, he meditated once more. So it's a bit pathetic, isn't it? But also quite a funny image. There's Milarepa standing there, clutching his loose clothing with one hand, trying to hold on to his firewood with the other hand, the gale blowing in the mountain. And then imagine that was you. Imagine you go into a faint, you wake up from your swoon, looking up at the blue sky and the branches of a tree, and there are your underpants gently flapping in the breeze. And you couldn't really help but laugh and also reflect on, well, he says on his ego clinging. And he felt that being blown by the wind had revealed his ego clinging, holding onto his wood, holding onto his robe. And I find this a really strong sense, the wind as a metaphor for energy. Are you blown by it, or is it blowing you? Or are you doing the blowing? Is it, in other words, what are called the worldly winds, or is it the breath of the Buddha? And when you feel that life is blowing you this way and that, is playing with you like the wind played with Milarepa, then you're at the mercy of the 8 worldly winds. And always these winds are blowing. Milarepa was hidden away in his mountain cave, but eventually he had to emerge. And there, despite his great spiritual maturity, the winds were still blowing. They were still gusting. They were trying to control him. So I thought I'd go into this. What are the 8 worldly winds? And they come in 4 pairs. And once again, I'll see if I can share a slide to show you what they are. So these are the 8 worldly winds. And this is a quote from the Buddha himself when he describes them. So he says, gain comes to ordinary people, but they do not reflect that this gain which has come is impermanent, painful, subject to change. They do not know it as it really is. And they think of the same of loss, of popularity and neglect, of approval and blame, of pleasure and suffering. So those are the worldly winds. Gain and loss, popularity and neglect, approval and blame, pleasure and suffering, blowing you this way and that. And the Buddha goes on, they welcome the gain which has arisen, they rebel against loss. They welcome popularity, they rebel against neglect. They welcome approval, they rebel against blame. They welcome pleasure, they rebel against suffering. And thus, given over to compliance and hostility, they're not freed from birth, old age, death, sorrows, lamentations, pains, miseries, and tribulations. I say that such ordinary people are not freed from suffering. So the worldly winds are the source of suffering, is what he's saying here. I'll say later on that we could probably come up with other pairs of worldly winds as well. But these ones are particularly strong. A very simple teaching this. It's easy to ignore it because it's so simple. Yes, of course, we all know that we'll have to experience loss as well as gain, neglect as well as popularity and everything like that. But speaking for myself, I don't behave as if I knew it. When things are going well for me, I can easily become intoxicated, obsessed, the Buddha calls it. But when they start to go badly, it seems so unfair. What have I done to deserve this? I'm constantly hoping I'll only get one side, the beneficial side, the welcome side of the worldly winds. And again, for a while, I'm being wafted along through life by the gentle, warm breeze of gain, but then the cold blasts of loss tumble me along in the other direction. Sometimes I'm liked and I'm popular, sometimes I'm ignored or I'm neglected. Sometimes I get lots of approval, and sometimes people seem to be telling me off all the time and saying that what's gone wrong is all my fault. And maybe most basic of all, sometimes I'm up, I'm cheerful, I'm elated, sometimes I'm down, I'm depressed or frustrated or dissatisfied. And I'm being blown around by these winds, but I unthinkingly assume that my life should be spent pursuing gain, popularity, happiness, and so on. But I'm deluding myself. It doesn't work. It's the natural thing to do, isn't it? The natural thing to do is to go for the pleasure and the happiness and the gain and the popularity and everything. But the Buddha's saying no. He says, because I don't reflect this gain which has come as impermanent, it's painful, it's subject to change, I don't know it as it really is. So therefore I welcome the gain and I rebel against the loss. And it's not possible, is it, to have a life which consists only of gain, of popularity, of approval and pleasure. I think these winds will always be blowing. But we don't have to be tossed around by them like a ship without a rudder. It's just a question of being governed less and less by knee-jerk reactions to sense input. Because every experience that we have is like a little puff of wind blowing in through the open windows of our senses. And another Buddhist teacher, Shantideva, says we tend to be like a little tuft of cotton. We're blown hither and thither by these winds like a dandelion seed. So imagine that you weren't a tuft of cotton. Imagine you became more weighty, you became more stable, more grounded. So instead of little puffs of stimulation governing your life, you could govern your life by deciding what is skillful, what's the creative way to live today. And this is a revolution. It's deposing the worldly winds from their tyranny over us. And this is what this stage of the Noble Eightfold Path means, perfect effort. When it comes to taking control, the crucial faculty is energy, effort. The special Buddhist path energy, which is called virya energy. And this is the kind of energy I want to say something about. So with awareness, you can start to realize that the force of the worldly winds is your own breath, as it were. It's your own vital energy. And in many traditions, the words for vital energy and spiritual energy are derived from the words for breath or wind. If you think of spirit, which comes from the Greek for breathing, prana, which also means breath, in yoga, in the Indian traditions. Energy is what the universe is made of. And it's also what makes life life, the energy of life. And it emerges on different levels. On the material level, it's heat, it's light, it's motion, and so on. But it's also the driving force of life, the driving force of evolution. Energy is what fuels consciousness as well. It's what fuels primitive awareness in animals. It also fuels human consciousness. Energy is what fuels your self-awareness. Now, sometimes we feel we haven't got it. We feel we're lacking in energy. But actually, we're made of energy. There's no shortage of energy. However, it gets locked up when we go against the grain of reality. It gets locked up when it's the energy of craving or of aversion or of half-conscious confusion. And that's what happens when I experience my energy as the worldly winds. I'm at their mercy when I tend to be rather passive, when I let life wash over me, hoping that pleasure and gain will just happen to me because I've turned up. That's what I hope, as if I deserved it every time. But half the time, instead, discomfort, or one of the other unpleasant, unwelcome winds rises up. So for myself, I tend to be rather unstable, like that ball of cotton, whenever I lack engagement. And really, engagement, joyous enthusiasm, those are also words, those are also definitions of what virya is. Engagement, joyous enthusiasm. When I was much younger, I was at university near Brighton, and I used to roam around on the South Downs, and it was usually windy up there, and I used to watch the kestrels riding on the gale. The wind used to stream over the scarp of the hills, but the kestrel would be completely still, apart from very tiny twitches of its wings and its flight feathers to keep it hovering in the wind. The wind was its fuel, the wind was its friend. And life is exploding with energy. You haven't got any choice about that, but you can choose something. Are you going to be passively blown around by the wind? Or are you going to try and maybe do the opposite? You're going to try and oppose the wind, try and lock it all up in conflicts. But that means you feel dead, you feel frustrated. And I don't think either of these alternatives is really worthy of a human being, but that is a third choice. You can decide to ride the wind like the kestrel, like a sailing vessel, to ride it with mindfulness. And this is what virya means, the motive power of virya. The energy of life only blows you around violently because you've not learnt how to direct it, how to tame it. And tamed, it becomes virya. And this word virya doesn't just mean any old energy. It's the enthusiasm, the determination that you feel to go for what really matters in human life. And virya is traditionally defined as directing one's mind to the skillful, and that's Vasubandhu. Or more simply, energy in pursuit of the good, energy in pursuit of the good, or directing the mind to the skillful. You've hoisted a sail, you've woken up the crew, you've grabbed hold of the wheel, and off you sail. If you imagine one of those tunes for the Onedin line or some other more recent TV series. So how do you mobilize virya? How do you direct your mind to the skillful? And this is where the four right efforts come in. When the Buddha teaches the Noble Eightfold Path, the sixth stage, perfect effort, the Buddha talks about the four right efforts. So I'm going to try and show you this on the screen again, if I can find them. So I'll read it out. In this connection, one produces longing, initiates virya, applies and exerts one's heart for the prevention of evil, unskillful mental states which have not yet arisen. Secondly, one produces longing, initiates virya, applies and exerts one's heart for the eradication of evil, unskillful mental states which have already arisen. Thirdly, one produces longing, initiates virya, applies and exerts one's heart for the development of skillful mental states which have not yet arisen. And finally, one produces longing, initiates virya, applies and exerts one's heart for the maintaining, the not forgetting, the increasing, the prevalence, the development, and the perfection of skillful mental states which have already arisen. There's a lot in there, really, isn't there? But also it's something very, very simple. Just distinguishing between skillful and unskillful mental states, and then deciding where you're going to put your energy, where you're going to put your effort. I remember the four of them as pedum: preventing and eradicating, developing and maintaining. Preventing and eradicating unskillful states of mind, developing and maintaining skillful states of mind. And you use mindfulness, guarding the senses, for preventing. You use the antidotes, the hindrances, for eradicating. For example, to eradicate the unskillful mental state of hatred, you cultivate loving kindness, you cultivate metta. And for developing new skillful mental states, the metta bhavana practice is a paradigm. You find the little embers of metta, of fellow feeling, under the ashes of your busy mind. You give them your bright attention, gently blowing on them until they burst into flame. And these, as you probably know, unskillful is the Buddhist word for ethical states of mind that result in deeds of loving kindness, of generosity, of calmness, of clarity of mind, of kindness of various kinds, of truthfulness, and so on. And the opposites of those are the unskillful mental states. How do you maintain existing skillful mental states? One way, there are many, many ways, but one way is to make sure that your skillful thoughts are actually translated into actions. If you're concerned, for example, about the current Black Lives Matter issues or the suffering that people are experiencing in the COVID crisis, if you find yourself thinking warmly or kindly of someone, then you think of something you could actually do, a present or a phone call or a letter or some service. Can you notice any skillfulness in your mental state right now? Is there anything you can do to help that to survive in the future? So these are the four right efforts: preventing, eradicating, developing, and maintaining. And it's as if every time you sit to meditate, every time you start a new day, you're faced with a you. And that you is rather like a neglected garden, a neglected allotment. First, you cut down the old weeds and the grasses to stop them spreading any more seeds. That's prevention. And then you dig out the weeds. That's eradication. Then you plant and nurture the veg and the flowers. That's developing. And then you look after the vegetables and the fruit and so on as it grows. That's maintaining. So it's very simple to say, isn't it? Very difficult to do, but very simple to say. So how do you get the energy going? How do you get this skillful energy alive? And here I want to go back to someone I've mentioned earlier, who's Shantideva. Now, Shantideva was a Buddhist philosopher and poet who lived in the 8th century in India. And he wrote a book called A Guide to the Bodhisattva's Way of Life. And there's a whole chapter in there on virya. I'm going to show you, if I can, I'll show you a picture of Shantideva. Share the screen. And there's Shantideva. Shantideva, I won't tell you why he's hovering in midair. There's a story to do with that. But he's got his book in front of him in a Tibetan form, the leaves of his book. So what does he say about this? Usually he's quite strict, Shantideva, usually even a bit puritanical. But in his chapter on virya, he's very provocative. And he uses this great Buddhist power of paradox, of contradiction. And after centuries in which Buddhism had been teaching people how to overcome lust and arrogance and laziness and so on, he suddenly draws these same words out of the hat and he gives them as the very basis for your skillful energy. And he says that what you need for virya includes lust, it includes arrogance, it includes pleasure, it includes rest, it even includes obsession. Lust, arrogance, pleasure, rest, obsession. So I'll go into that a little bit, see if I can understand what he's saying. It's well worth reading him, reading the text of A Guide to the Bodhisattva's Way of Life. I'll come out of the share, show you a book. There are several translations available. This one by Andrew Skilton and Kate Crosby is the most accessible one, probably, in the Oxford World Classics, with some good commentary in it as well. So what he says, what Shantideva says, is that virya starts with desire, with lust, more literally desire. And what he means here is a longing, a yearning for the good, a yearning for what is skillful, even a yearning for enlightenment itself. And he says you get this by considering the consequences of your actions. This longing, this yearning. So in a way you could say that lust is okay. Lust or longing or yearning is okay. And if you think about it, you'll decide the only way of getting real happiness is not by pursuing it as one of the worldly winds, but by skillful action. And in fact, this is quite traditional. The Buddha himself said there's nothing wrong with desire itself, despite what people sometimes say about Buddhism. It's the interest, it's the fascination that allows you to choose what part of your experience to engage with. So it's absolutely essential. It's one of the necessary states of mind. It's called chanda, interest, longing. The old texts call it the stretching forth of the mind's hand towards the object. The mind's hand needs to reach out, it needs to do that. The problem is a different kind of desire, or one of the kinds of stretching out, which is the desire for stimulation, for self-gratification, and so on, because that's what leads to unskillful craving. So that's problematic. However, this longing for enlightenment is not sufficient. You need to begin to think that you actually can do it. You need to gain some confidence. You need to begin to think that if you only start, you'll get there. You could even become a Buddha. And this is very arrogant. So you need a sort of a heroic pride. And the way Shantideva puts it is he says, I must do it. I must do it myself. I shall defeat all my own petty faults, and then I shall defeat all the greed, hatred, and delusion in the world. And he goes on to say, I must conquer everything. Nothing should conquer me. This pride, this arrogance should be wedded to me, for I am a son of the lion-like Buddha. So that's Shantideva on the value of positive pride, of self-confidence, self-assurance. And then the next thing is relish or pleasure. And Shantideva insists it's not just that working on yourself with virya will lead to future happiness. That work itself is delightful. So relish, so pleasure is not a problem. It's not a bad thing. The work itself is bliss, he says. Virya is not a weary, plodding struggle. It's not always doing what you don't want to do out of duty. It's not a sort of anxious, driven urgency that estranges you from your real experience. No, it is joyful. And the Tibetans often call virya joyous exertion. And Shantideva goes on. He says, as soon as one skillful act is completed, one should plunge immediately into the next one, like an elephant hot from the midday sun who plunges into the cooling waters of the next lotus pool. So that's a great image, your life like an elephant in the heat of the sun, leaping amongst the lotuses, the coolness of the pond. And the next thing that Shantideva talks about that's necessary for virya is rest, letting go, relaxation. And that's a very surprising aspect of energy. You should say that energy means just keep going, carry on, you know. But as I was pondering this talk last night, the clock was creeping round, it was time for bed, it was getting later. And you need to marshal your energies, don't you? I needed to understand when it was time to put my task on one side, to refresh myself with sleep, or to refresh myself with recreation, with relaxation. And the way Shantideva puts it, he says, let the task go, still with thirst the next task and then the next task. So before you get demoralized, before you get burnt out, you need to be able to drop it just to take a rest. And last week I had a whole week off and it was wonderful to do that. I've been so busy at the Buddhist Center trying to get everything online and all sorts of discussions, getting a new website out, talking about reopening the center. And I felt a bit bad, we can't really take the week off, but we've got other excellent people at the center. And as far as I know, I don't even know what's happened, but nothing disastrous as far as I know. You need to take some rest. And then finally, obsession, or at least dedication. And what this is a total mindful involvement with what you're doing. Engagement was the word I used earlier. If you try and do something when you're not really engaged with it, it can be really painful. But then life seems so complicated, and sometimes you think, oh, I'm not sure if this is what I really want to be doing. And so you get bored. It happens in meditation, doesn't it? You get restless, your mind drifts. Maybe you start to rehearse old conversations. Oh, I wish I'd said such and such. Or you plan tomorrow's outing. But then tomorrow comes, you're on the outing, and you only half engage once again. Instead of enjoying what you're doing, you start planning and fantasizing and regretting things yet again. So during meditation, during Buddhist practice and chanting, or even during a chat with somebody, have you experienced that where you just start to let go and disengage? And this is a very hard one, actually. There's not an easy answer, but maybe you just need to start by deciding, am I actually doing this or not? Is this what I am doing now? And if you decided, yeah, this is what I'm doing, then engage, get into it. Even if you're not 100% sure why you're doing it. Because if you don't engage, you're not really alive. In the Dharmapada, the Buddha says The unmindful are like the dead. The unengaged are like the dead. But the mindful never die. And it's easy to say this, isn't it? Just engage. But for me, this is work in progress. There's a terrible trap. How do I use my conditions well? I've got fantastic conditions. I've had a very, very lucky life. How do I follow through my decisions? Well, I've got to engage. How do I engage? Well, just engage. But then a voice, says, "Oh, I don't want to." Shut up, just engage. But what if I drift out of being engaged? Just engage again. And this is, isn't it, in miniature, this is what happens in the mindfulness of breathing. Engage with the breath. Oh, I've lost it. Oh, just engage. Just engage. You just need to keep saying, just come back to what's actually happening now. So this is Shantideva, and what you need to set up your virya, your energy. You need a lust or a longing for what's truly of value, a sort of arrogance, a heroic pride in your capacity as a human being, pleasure and delight what you're doing, being prepared to relax when it's necessary, and a wholehearted, even an obsessive engagement with mindfulness. And Shantideva and other Mahayana teachers like Gampopa, the great Tibetan teacher, they all emphasize the four right efforts that the Buddha taught when they talk about virya, but they also expand their discussion of cultivating the skillful by adding an extra category. As well as the right efforts, there is working for the welfare of others. And you may feel you can meditate, you may feel you can't meditate, maybe you feel you can't get your head around the Dharma, maybe you feel you can't gain insight, but you can always do things for other people. You're not sure what to do. Find a kind action for someone you're in contact with, especially in these days, I think. But what if you feel, you've got no energy, can't be bothered, can't get it together, too lazy, depressed, life trickling away through my hands, letting myself be blown around by the worldly winds like a piece of cotton. Okay, so how do you do that? There's a very good lecture by Sangharakshita on virya in the series on the Bodhisattva ideal, and in it, he points out making your energies available is the central task of the Buddhist life. Making your energies available is the central task. But sometimes you find they're not very available. And usually this is because they're blocked, they're wasted, or they're too coarse. I'll see if I can show a little list of those. Thank you. So making your energies available is the central task of the Buddhist life. They're not available because they're blocked, they're wasted, they're too coarse. And maybe it's blocked because you're holding your feelings in check. Maybe you feel guilty about your feelings. Maybe your work and your life are very unfulfilling and uncreative. Maybe you don't have much chance to communicate authentically with other people. These are all issues when your energy seems blocked up. So find an awareness of this repression. Find genuinely fulfilling creative work and take the risk to genuinely, authentically communicate with people. And all these things can unblock your energies. And then what about wastage of energy? Especially this is turning unskillful thoughts and feelings over and over in your mind, or even more draining, giving expression to them in speech. And our speech can be really draining, can be really waste our energy, especially if it's full of little examples of competitiveness or self-centered anxiety or irritability and so on. So silence is a great way to stop wasting energy, especially on retreat. I really suggest you try that. Get away on a retreat and try some silence. Finally, you may find that you've got plenty of energy, but it's rather gross, it's rather boisterous. Maybe it's mainly just physical energy. You can't use it for meditation, you can't use it for subtle communication. And their suggestions from Sangharakshita are using the fine arts, using devotional practice like puja and so on, and they can deal with that. Okay, so I'm going to start to think about winding up. I'll just give you a little summary of what we've talked about before I find some images to conclude with. I talked about the 8 worldly winds, which are the opposite of virya, gain and loss, popularity and neglect, or maybe popularity and loneliness nowadays, approval and blame, pleasure and suffering. And this is the Buddha's list, but you might have other polarities, other ways in which you get buffeted back and forth: wealth and poverty, success and failure, health and sickness, high status, low status, company and separation, freedom and restriction, liking and aversion. All these polarized pairs are worth looking at, thinking over. Are you being blown around by them? They're going to gust back and forth. They are going to. But are you governed by them? Or are you starting to let go of them, become more solid in the face of them through virya? So virya, I said, is a special form of energy. It's your enthusiasm for what really matters. It's energy in pursuit of the good. And then I went through the four right efforts: preventing and eradicating unskillful states, developing and maintaining skillful states, plus this extra one, energy working for the welfare of others. And then Shantideva, what you need for virya is, paradoxically speaking, desire and pride, or arrogance even, relish and delight, letting go or rest, and dedication, even an obsessive sort of engagement. And I said, if you don't have energy, maybe it's because it's blocked, because it's wasted, or because it's too coarse. So I started with the wind and the image of Milarepa, clutching the woods to him, clutching his robes as the storm was blowing him around. And this amazing invisible power of the wind is the symbol for energy. At first, maybe we'd rather the wind just died down. We'd rather just sit in the sun on a still day. But we need that wind. We need energy. We need engagement and enthusiasm. We need virya. So gradually we learn that the wind can be a friend, that deep down energy is what we're made of. It's the only thing that shifts us out of our current predicament. And this emblem of the wind is very strong in the Buddhist tradition. I'll show you a couple of images that may bring this to life for you. So the first one is called the wind horse. The wind horse. And the wind horse flies through, a mythical horse that flies through the sky with the 3 jewels on its back. And also we have the green Buddha, the Buddha of wind. Believe it or not, there is a Buddha of wind. And this is the Buddha Amoghasiddhi, the Buddha of the north, who's shown being borne aloft by shang birds, clashing cymbals as they fly through the air. He's the Buddha of magic. He's the Buddha also of stability as well as of the energy of wind. And in particular, I think of the wind on the ocean. And I think of the wind on the ocean, the gales that allowed the fast sailing clippers to bring tea back from China in the days before steam and before diesel boats. I also think of a very strange story by Doris Lessing, great, one of my favorite novelists. And she called it Briefing for a Descent into Hell, Briefing for a Descent into Hell. And I don't know if you've read it, but in it, there's a university professor who descends into mental illness. And in the mental hospital, they're trying drugs and they're trying shock therapy to bring him back to sanity. But in his own mind, he's on a small boat in the South Atlantic Ocean, and he's being driven round and round by irresistible winds, winds that won't allow him to escape the circle of the ocean currents. But eventually he defeats both the winds and the drugs they're trying to give him, and he marshals the wind to take him to a strange mystic island where he discovers that he has a far greater purpose than being a university professor, trying to get back to ordinary sanity. So can you relate to that? The endless circling round and round in the ocean or in the wheel of life, or sloshing backwards and forwards between opposites with the worldly winds. But the basic energy that's there in the wind, even in the worldly winds, is the same energy that can pursue the skillful, that can pursue enlightenment. And we can use those winds as our virya. We encounter so many unwelcome experiences in our life. We have many maybe shameful impulses coming up in ourselves, but the teaching of virya shows that whatever appears, it can be a talisman. It can become a strength. You can convert it into something skillful. Nothing needs rejecting. You just pick it up and you hold it with an open and receptive heart. And they're rather terrifying things, the worldly winds. We go for gains, but we can't avoid loss as well. The more we want popularity, the more we feel neglected, when we're not getting very much attention. This is this endless round. But the energy in there is the same energy that fills the sails of the skillful. Murgasidi, this mythic green wind Buddha, makes no noise as he flashes by. He leaves no trail, seems to have no effect. Yet there's the sense of enlightenment being there, being possible, making everything completely different. And there's a hint of that in Shelley's poem, which I think I'll finish with. And Shelley is talking to the wild west wind. I'll show you this on the screen if I can. I'm not going to do the whole poem, it's quite a long one. If I were a dead leaf, thou mightest bear. If I were a swift cloud to fly with thee, a wave to pant beneath thy power, and share the impulse of thy strength, only less free than thou, O uncontrollable. Remember, he's talking to the west wind. Oh, lift me as a wave, a leaf, a cloud. Make me thy lyre, even as the forest is. Be thou spirit fierce, my spirit. Be thou me, impetuous one. Drive my dead thoughts over the universe like withered leaves, to quicken a new birth. And by the incantation of this verse, scatter, as from an inextinguished hearth, ashes and sparks, my words among mankind. Be through my lips to unawakened earth the trumpet of a prophecy.